are listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, dear listener. My name is Silas Rose, and you are tuned into Awake in Relationship. It's hard to imagine a job more difficult or meaningful than being a teacher. Teachers, especially the really gifted ones, can have a really profound influence on young learners that goes far beyond the mere imparting of knowledge. If you look back on your own life, you probably have a few examples of educators that showed up in your life just at the right time to impart some kind of wisdom, or maybe acted as a kind of a savior when you were going through a rough time. For me, it was a very eccentric grade 10 English teacher, Mr. Perrant, who really inspired me a love of literature. He often smoked a pipe on break, and as students we often wondered if what was in that pipe that gave it this kind of magical quality. I literally owe my life to a middle school teacher, Mrs. Denman, who performed the Heimlich on me after I choked on a piece of watermelon in a watermelon eating context. I really see teachers as ambassadors of the culture, capable of both transmitting values, but also the biases and anxieties of society. There's a path quality to teaching that often doesn't get spoken about, which very much involves engaging our innate awareness and compassion. However, this gets often lost in a busy classroom where learning objectives and the curriculum take priority. For both learners and educators, it's really hard to stay connected to the heart when there's so many demands bearing down on you. However, if we want to inspire the next generation to be brave, loving, and open in the face of so much uncertainty, we have to put the heart back in the classroom. This, I believe, is what separates good teachers from great teachers. In this episode of Work in Relationship, I speak with Noel McLellan, educator and author of Teaching Bravery, Meditation and Heart Advice for Teachers. In this conversation, Noel and I discuss the inner path of teaching and how meditation can both transform the learning environment and the process of teaching from one of stress and overwhelm into the possibility of a deeper connection with learners and the natural rising of wisdom that results when we are more fully present. This mindful approach is just as applicable to parents as it is to teachers. So if you have young learners in your life, this episode's for you. Noel, good morning and welcome to Awake in Relationship.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So you have kind of a unique background, having grown up in a Buddhist home. It's kind of how I know you, actually. Curious how that sort of shaped your interest and understanding of education.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, which was sort of a hub of the Shambhala Buddhist community. And I went to one of the early private schools that was inspired by the Shambhala tradition. And, it was in what was kind of the edge of open space. In those days, it was kind of open space. So there was some kind of natural landscape to frolic in there. And it was a unique kind of little school, a small little school. And I don't know if I really appreciated it until later. But later when I went on to public school and experienced a sort of more chaotic environment, a much larger environment, in some ways an environment which had more aggression in it, that planted some kind of seed in me. And as I grew up and got older, I started to reflect on how much in that school and also just in my upbringing in general, there was a kind of culture that was kind of based on a sense of trust and care about me as a human being. And I started to see that didn't exist everywhere in the world. And noticing that contrast and starting to appreciate that contrast more when I got older, I started to have the notion that I wanted that to be in the world. I wanted to be a part of making that a bigger part of the world. And so it kind of grew from there. My interest in education gradually started to develop from there. So, it wasn't so much that I loved school. I really didn't. Most of the time when I was in school, I didn't like it very much. But it was a sense like it could be better. Like this could be better in the world, and maybe I could help with that somehow.
So your book, Teaching Bravery, is uniquely written for teachers, of course. And why was that important, as opposed to writing something for learners?
Yeah, I think in my contemplation, there was a few factors there. So yeah, I wanted the book to be for teachers. In one part of it was just practical, which was that I understand that teachers, there's such an array of contexts that teachers teach in, from very small children up through university age students, and everything in between, and all subjects and different kinds of environments. And the idea of teaching something, that would be about developing curriculums that could be applied in those situations, just seemed like too much for me. I didn't have enough, of a range of experience to even think about doing something like that. So that was one part of it. But another part was that the commonality through those things is the central role of the teacher in classroom environments and in education environments. That no matter what kind of teaching methodology you have, and these days a lot of teachers are teaching in a way where it's like they're less of a kind of a focal point. They might be doing more of a collaborative approach with their students, but nevertheless, there's always the presence of the teacher in the environment, which represents the major reference point for students, especially young students, especially for children. They really see their teachers as being these very sort of titanic figures in their world, and the influence of their example, how they are as a human being, is profoundly formative and meaningful for young people. So it felt kind of strategic, I guess, from that point of view, that if we could reach teachers, support teachers, help teachers to develop themselves, that could be kind of a node for infusing something into classrooms of whatever kind, whatever kind of context.
Yeah, well, I think teaching is probably one of the hardest jobs out there, and especially after 2 years of COVID, it just really, there's many things about our education system that just sort of feels broken. What sort of challenges? You're a high school teacher, is that right?
I teach middle school and high school, yeah.
Oh, okay. What sort of challenges do you think your students face right now that perhaps you or I didn't when we were growing up?
Oh my goodness. I mean, it's tough, I think we really live in a world where there's just so much transformation happening all the time. I think the biggest thing is that there's this sense of catastrophe that exists in the world right now. And, when I grew up, there was a sense of like, oh, the world has a lot of problems, but it didn't feel like necessarily we were living in a time of like global catastrophe.
Well, I might interject that. Well, you're younger than I am. The Cold War definitely looms large in my kind of psyche.
Same, yeah. The Cold War was still on when I was a kid, and I remember feeling like, if I heard a loud jet fly overhead, my first thought was this could be it. Mm-hmm. So it was really intense, and that was a big deal. Mm-hmm. I think that the compounded levels of something like the effects of transformative technology, especially climate change, the way it is right now, some of the ways that, the kind of capitalist fabric of society are falling apart. And then we add in things like a global pandemic. I think it's on a different level. And so it's more challenging now for students just to have a sense of, what we might call promise or stability or hope, looking ahead into their futures and, having a sense of like, what we thought of as normal, like, oh, I'm going to live a normal life. There's a sense of like, who knows? There's tremendous uncertainty. And part of that creates a kind of desire to just live in distraction, kind of just be comfortable. And we've always had that, but I would say it's, those distractions and comforts are more readily available now. So it's even more intense in a way.
It's in our pocket.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. How has technology either helped or hindered the learning environment?
Oh man, I mean, there's so much to say about technology. It's a huge force, and it tends to get kind of boiled down to like, oh, people are kind of pro or anti, effects of technology. But I think, one thing that I think is really interesting about it is that young people now rely on it tremendously for their self-expression. Mm-hmm. And for their social connection, their social environments, in a way that wasn't even true, 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. So one thing I've noticed is that students are less self-expressive in the classroom. They tend to, they're hiding a little bit more. I mean, it doesn't help that, we've been wearing masks for a couple of years, so you can't even see students' faces. But so students are really relying on it in new ways. I mean, it's not without its wondrous elements in terms of like learning. There's so much potential of ways we can use technology for learning in the environment. But what I notice the most is probably the way it just affects our kind of the classroom atmosphere. And I think one of the keys to that, which I've kind of come around to as a teacher, is that I have to surrender to some extent that if I just take a kind of like high-handed approach, it's like, oh, all these new social media platforms, I don't respect them, and I don't understand them. All I really accomplish by doing that is putting myself in a different world than my students. And, so it's actually pretty important to have some kind of balance where we, inquire into them and try to maybe learn a little bit about them so that we can stay on the same, plane of existence and have decent conversations with our students to understand where they're coming from. And then often, if they feel respected, they might be willing to also listen to like, oh, there's a world outside of that as well. And, so we have to navigate it together, basically. Otherwise, we just develop greater generational rifts, which are really a big thing right now.
Yeah. Well, one of the challenges I see with the technology, particularly for young people, is how it affects self-perception.
Yes, exactly. I was reading about that recently. Actually, a Buddhist teacher who was talking about kind of a traditional way of looking at Buddhist psychology is that, we don't have just one self. We have different kind of sort of clusters of experience. And then we tend to think of them all as one self. And in a kind of modern context, he was saying one of those clusters is really like our online persona. It's like one part of our ego or our sense of self-perception just exists online now. And that's the way it is. It's pretty weird, but it's true.
You mentioned earlier that teachers really have this kind of outsized effect on young people, that they are sort of seen as the modern day elder, which can be both positive or negative depending on the psychology of the teacher, are there examples from your own life, maybe growing up, of kind of an extraordinary teacher that really kind of embodied the positive qualities of that mentor elder, and what made them so great?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I think just to address the first part of your question, um, I think, it would be good if teachers were really regarded as elders in our modern society, and elders in the sense of the way that the term is used maybe in certain indigenous traditions and that kind of thing, like holders of traditional culture and holders of traditional wisdom. The idea that like spending time around these people is going to be good for you. You're going to learn how to be from them, from their example. And if we took that approach, it would be really helpful, because it would on the one hand put the onus on teachers to cultivate themselves to be worthy of such a role, and maybe to think a little bit beyond being just knowledge receptors, or knowledge conveyors rather. But also, I think one thing that's come up a bit during the pandemic is people have realized that even more that teachers often don't get very well respected in society. They're sort of thought of as sort of low-level scholars or babysitters or what have you. But it's true, especially with young people, teachers can have a profound influence on the lives of their students in ways which sometimes don't show up for decades. A lot of students don't realize, I know from my own experience, I didn't always realize that certain teachers had profoundly impacted me until I'd had some time to reflect on that. I can think of a handful, in different contexts. I guess I mention a few. There was one person who was a founder of a summer camp I used to go to, Sun Camp, Shambhala Sun Camp, and his name was Will Riken, and he really inspired a tremendous loyalty and admiration among many teenagers. It was a camp for 10 to 16-year-olds. Pretty life-changing experience for a lot of people. And people would ask, what's the secret? Like, what's your key to what you're doing? And he would always say that the main thing was that he saw the campers, he saw the teenagers, the youth as warriors. And in other words, he saw like the kind of fully embodied, virtuous part of them. And he spoke to that warrior in them. He kind of, saw past the surface, saw past the unfinished personality, the punky teenagery personality or, behaviors, and spoke to the warrior. And the effect of that was that the warrior in us heard itself being called out or called in, being summoned. And that's a very profound experience, actually. You can actually have an experience where, the teacher in this case trusts you more than you trust yourself. They don't necessarily trust that you're going to, know how to chop a carrot or something like that, if you haven't learned that. But they trust you fundamentally. They trust that your being is worthy. And that's a very profound level of trust that most people actually don't really have in themselves. So if another person can kind of summon that within you, it plants a seed. You have a sense of like, oh, I could develop that trust myself.
My sense with kids, especially younger children, is they have a remarkable bullshit detector. And they actually have a lot of wisdom. But often, as adults and as educators, that gets missed. It seems like there's a lot of assumptions that teachers come into the classroom with that really kind of get in the way of the teacher-student relationship. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
One thing we need to think about more is like, what's our motivation? Why are we wanting to be teachers at all? And I think it would be really good if in teacher training, we spent more time contemplating what the fundamental motivation is of education altogether, for one thing, but of our own kind of path as a teacher as well. And sometimes when I talk to teaching students who are in school or people who are thinking about becoming teachers, I ask them, what do they want to be a teacher for? And it's always very revealing. Like, some of the time, people want to teach because they love being learners, which is great. Maybe they love English literature, and so they love to share English literature. But I actually tell them a lot of the time, maybe you want to go be a university teacher in that case, but you might not want to be a middle school teacher because, your middle school students are mostly not going to appreciate what you love about your subject. So it's really important that, like, if you're going to teach youth, that really what you're there for is them. And, beginning with some kind of like basic attitude that we're curious about them, that we're there to serve them and to cultivate them and to connect with them. That's the primary thing, and that we're there to like teach them, but we're also there to honor their intelligence. And and then we become learners in our jobs. We should be learning as we teach, and we should be kind of constantly surprised and awakened by the brilliance that comes out of our students, and not just out of our students, but out of the kind of the interaction that happens with our students, which is often the most beautiful thing. And it can be really easy to miss it because, we have an agenda, like we have to teach our lessons. And so, it's a balance. Like, of course we do have to teach the lessons, but those lessons are happening within a context of interaction and relationship. And we can look at that relationship as being kind of the main sort of dojo, the main space where we're training and learning together. And, a story comes to mind. This is just a recent experience that happened. My colleague just shared this with me a week or two ago, where we have a student, I'll call him Sam, who's come to us from a pretty rough background, young student, middle school student. We could say he has definitely a history with some pretty complex trauma, has a pretty hard time developing trust in relationships, and exhibits a lot of challenging behaviors, and often kind of sabotages himself by not really even being willing to try in certain circumstances. So in science, in my colleague's class, he would never even put a word down on tests. He just would sit there and wouldn't try at all. And he also would often say, kind of, I think maybe out of, some kind of strange attempt to get attention or whatever, he would say sort of, shocking things. And on this particular day, they had a test, another science test, and this student said, "You'd better give me an A on the test, Mr. Fletcher, or I'm going to put poison in your coffee." And the teacher said, "Oh, you would never do that, Sam, because we care about each other much too much for that." The student got really quiet, and he actually had some tears in his eyes, and he just became very reflective from that response. And then he wrote the test, and he got like a 40% on it, which, by a kind of like typical kind of objective measure of some kind is a really bad mark. It's less than a 50% mark. But for a student who had never been willing to put a word on the test, it was absolutely outstanding. It was like really genuine progress. And so, I think it's that kind of thing where, honestly, when I heard that story, I thought, like, I might have reprimanded that student for saying that to me. I might have been like, "That's inappropriate. Don't say horrible things like that. Write your damn test, whatever." And instead, he kind of reversed the impulse completely and really went for the heart. And the results really came out in a completely different way. So, that's a kind of example where the student's teacher and the student's kind of heart and intelligence and the teacher's heart and intelligence kind of mixed together.
That's beautiful. And really kind of a powerful example of what we call in our community basic goodness, bodhicitta, awakened heart. Yeah. And that's the center of your book, really. And the center of, or rather the foundation of what you kind of refer to or have referred to as the inner path of the teacher. Most teachers I know, and also parents, of course, are in complete overwhelm trying to deliver a curriculum or learning objectives and often kind of ignoring their own self-care. What I love about your book is it presents the possibility that the whole learning environment and the process of teaching can be something that's nourishing and that there's a path quality and could lead to some form of mastery and deeper connection with your own heart and the heart of your students. How does meditation help that process?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. That especially in the last couple of years, the whole situation has been really overwhelming. And, a lot of the contexts that people have found themselves in, trying to deliver education online, trying to deliver education with no training at home. And now people are going back to school, and it's overwhelming in entirely new ways in a lot of cases. And that's just in the last couple of years. Like, school has been overwhelming for teachers for a long time. So I think one thing to start off, I think it's really important to acknowledge is that we should talk about like self-cultivation, self-care, mindfulness, and so forth. But it's really important to acknowledge that it's not just our kind of inability to care for ourselves that are making things overwhelming. It's the whole system isn't actually working well. And so the contexts we're finding themselves, teachers are finding themselves in, and parents are not functioning properly. They're not actually very entirely workable, and they need to change. So yes, we can develop ways to help ourselves cope with them better, but we at the same time need to be thinking about ways that we completely restructure those situations and re-envision those situations so that they actually don't lead us into perpetual burnout and overwhelm. But, going back to more the individual, like, I do think one of the roles that comes in there altogether is is the individual and the individual's relationship to their teaching life. And if we could sort of just start by looking at daily activity, in this case teaching, but really daily activity altogether, as being a field of self-cultivation, a journey of self-cultivation and self-transformation. That would be a big shift altogether from the start. So, often we look at kind of self-care and mindfulness as being like, I think people think of it as like being like a little bit of water that we're sprinkling on the fire, to kind of, things are really intense and we're really out of control and it's really stressful. And then we kind of need to soothe ourselves down a bit. And we do, that's true. We need to take care of ourselves, especially in a society that emphasizes overwork and almost glorifies kind of like stress. We could really think differently about that. But a really deeper approach altogether would be to think about like, how do we actually transform our lives on a deep level, so that the kind of principles and values that we really cherish could start to express themselves in the culture that we're creating and that we're coexisting within.
That's something that came up in your book, is that teachers really are kind of ambassadors of the values, anxieties and fears of the society. And if we want a different result in the future, it really begins with the teachers, that they have to transmit something that's radically different from what we have.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think, that's where really meditation is a really essential factor, because it's about self-reflection and being able to look inward, look into our own experience, look into what's happening in our state of mind, starting to learn how to feel our hearts and actually kind of be in our hearts and trust our experience as human beings. And, so much of our society, so much of our culture, it's a kind of negotiation that we move through where we're trying to figure out how to be and what kind of person we want to be. And, we want to be comfortable and we want to make money and we want to do things that are, this thing or that thing. But the through line, of course, is just ourselves. And, going to that really basic level of learning how to be who we are.
This comes back to the topic of bravery. You can't really teach bravery. It has to be modeled.
Exactly. Yeah. So we have to kind of, through meditation, we start to kind of learn that on a kind of level of our kind of body, on the level of our cells, the level of our nervous system. It's not a skill set per se. It's just something that kind of starts to seep into us. And once it seeps into us, we start to source that from ourselves. We start to be the source of strength, our own source of strength. So I think that's the difference is, a lot of the time we kind of, we're looking for sources of strength outside of ourselves. And those things are often unreliable or inaccessible. But if we could be our own source of strength, then that's always available to us. And, our world is going to be constantly changing. We're always going to be facing obstacles, challenges. The classroom is always like that. It's a never-ending source of, new percolating difficulties that are bubbling up. That's just the way it is with young people. When you put a bunch of young people in a room, the nature of their life is transformation. So it's always happening and coming along, and we have to kind of learn how to ride that. But starting to kind of have a sense of strength in ourselves is the only way to do that.
That's probably a great place to end our conversation. I really enjoyed this, Noel. Thank you so much. And I know that you actually have a short course on your website. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, happy to. My website is noelmclellan.com. People are interested in finding my book, it's there. And I created an online video course as well during the lockdown phase of the pandemic, which covers similar, more or less the same material that's in my book in a slightly different way, if people enjoy that kind of format. My approach both with my book and this course is that teachers are, as we mentioned, they're overwhelmed, they're pretty busy. So they're both set up to be things people can do in small doses. Ideally, they kind of don't just try to do the whole course in a day or two, but they could do 10-minute snippets of it, over a course of time. And in that way, it can become a kind of sustaining resource for people. And, we learn best in small doses, I think. When I wrote the book, my aspiration was maybe a few teachers will, end up keeping this book on their desk at school. And every once in a while, I get a message from someone who says, I keep your book on my desk at school, and I just open it here and there when I'm having a hard time. And so I feel they're quite fulfilled by that, which is wonderful.
Thanks again to Noel for this hard advice on the art of teaching. If you want to learn more about Noel's work or his course, head over to noelmcclellan.com. I'll put some links in the show notes at awakenrelationship.com. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. And if you have a moment, I'd really appreciate a quick review wherever you listen to podcasts. I always appreciate hearing from my audience. If you want to send feedback or ideas for future guests on Awaken Relationship, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.